I'm sure that more than a few of you listeners of the show have heard, at least once, that the science fiction coming out of mainland China is some of the most forward-thinking and also relevant to our lives, possibly relevant to our futures science fiction that anyone's read in a long time. But what if I told you, and here feel free to visualize Lawrence Fishburne as Morpheus popping on his glasses or whatever it is he does while he's talking to poor old Neo. What if I told you that there was a science fiction novel written in the 90s in Taiwan, in quote marks, the other China, that is actually more relevant to our lives today and could very well be much more relevant to the futures that we're going to live in the coming decades? Well, we're actually going to be talking about that book on this episode. You probably saw that coming. The two guests are going to be the author and the translator of said book. So, Ta-wei or Ta-wei. I'm going to be saying Ta-wei in this coming interview, and the translator, Larissa Heinrich. They're going to be with me. But before we get to the interview, we're going to do the TrChFic news. Although I should probably say, because I've not said this on the show for ages, I'm Angus Stewart, and you're listening to the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast. It's worth mentioning, by the way, that this is now the first episode of the Taiwan season that I'm going to be doing on the show. You may be excited to know that there's going to be at least one more, very likely two more, science fiction books, or stories at least, that we cover on this season. But there's quite a selection of other stuff I've got lined up too. There's also going to be another queer fiction book, quite an important one. If you know your Taiwanese lit, you'll be able to guess what it is. That'll be on the show. I guess I haven't mentioned yet that The Membranes is without a doubt queer fiction too. So that's what's coming up in the interview too. But before that, we have the TrChFic news. Right, so here is the TrChFic news. We got 3 items today. The first is a panel. This was an event that I actually took part in, and it has already happened, so this is now up for streaming up on YouTube. The event was hosted by Essence of Wonder. They're sort of like an online platform. They host lots of sci-fi themed events. They interview authors a lot. So they did this sort of online Zoom event live, and like I said, it's up for streaming. So its full title was Exploring Chinese Science Fiction Multi-Dimensionally. Fiction, translation, fandom, industry, and more. And I was one of, I think, eight speakers. The panel was divided in two. There was, an Asia panel and a Europe panel, basically just because of time zone problems. So part 1, the Asia panel, was pretty much a PRC panel. It had Regina Canyu Wang, Chen Qiufan, Feng Zhang, and Emily Jin. So that is Regina is all sorts of things. Author, does she do translation? I'm not sure, but just about everything you could think of, like PR, hosting events, helping with rights sales, I think even. Chen Qiufan, who is an author, and he also actually translates from English into Chinese, and is just sort of a thinker, public intellectual these days. Feng Zhang, who is a critic, so he had a really interesting perspective on trying to sort of, through discussion and criticism, keep just the push to get the writing quality of domestic science fiction in China higher. And then Emily Jin, who's a translator and who's been on the show, just like Chen Qiufan, actually, 2 former guests of the show. And then in the Europe panel, we had 4 people, including myself. We had Yan Wei, who's, I think I've mentioned her a few times on the show, friend of the pod. Xueting Christine Ni, who's she's got a translated anthology of Chinese science fiction on the way. Angus Stewart, don't know who that guy is. And then Guanzhao Liu, or Liu Guanzhao, or Lu Guanzhao, I should say. Another former guest of the show and one of the 2 leaders of the London Chinese Science Fiction group. It was a really great chat. I think we covered just about every angle of Chinese sci-fi you could wish to hear covered. I'm sure we may have missed something, but I'll leave that for you guys to find out after you go have a listen. So that's the first news item. Second news item, now this is something you can pre-order. It's an upcoming book, Vessel, a Memoir by Cai Chongda. Now this is a translation by another friend of the pod, Mr. Dylan Levi King. And this is sort of, I know this one's a big deal for him because he's interested in getting voices, or writers, I should say, Chinese writers who have views that aren't just sort of simplistic box ticking for Western readers. He likes trying to get these sort of voices which might be alternative within the PRC, but certainly in translation are really something a little different. I understand that was part of the appeal, I think, for Dylan. I'll just read the blurb that HarperCollins, the publisher, have got up. It's not too long, and it'll do a better job of explaining than I can. An unprecedented and heartfelt memoir that illuminates the lives of rural Chinese workers, offering a portrait of generational strife, family love and loss that crosses cultures and time. Cai Chongda spent his childhood in a rural fishing village in Fujian province. When his father, a former communist gang leader turned gas station owner, has a stroke that partially paralyzes him, his responsibilities fall to Cai, his only son. Assuming his new role as head of the family, Cai toils alongside his mother and older sister to pay the medical bills that have become a part of a rapidly changing Chinese society. As Cai works his way through university and moves to Beijing, eventually becoming a director of GQ China, he finds his life increasingly at odds with the family he supports but has left behind. Like The Glass Castle and Hillbilly Elegy, Vessel neither romanticizes nor condemns the people and circumstances that shaped a young man's life, but instead offers a way forward, revealing how tradition can enrich modern life. And I should also say the cover it's a really nice cover. I like it a lot. I'll just let you guys look it up. So yeah, well done, Dylan. That's really cool that that's out there. Might be fun to talk about it on the show, because I know it's not fiction, but I've broken that rule a few times. Like, we've had Cao Mao, we've had Li Juan, so we could have Cai Chongda. That would be acceptable, I think. Okay, the last news item, it's more sci-fi. I'm sorry, I'm just obsessed, aren't I? It's a very special thing happening for the London Chinese Science Fiction Group, the one I just mentioned a few minutes ago, mentioning Guangzhou, one of its two hosts. So they're having their second anniversary coming up, and to kind of celebrate it, they're having a huge star as a guest on the show. It's the Chinese science fiction writer Han Song, who I'd say is probably my personal favourite, at least based on everything I've read in translation. And the story of his that they'll be covering is My Country Does Not Dream, 我的祖国不做梦. Those are all characters I knew, by the way, except Zhu. I was only sort of half sure of that one. 祖国, at least according to Google Translate, means motherland. Looks pretty cool. That's happening on the 2nd of May. That story is available in translation in a new book that's just come out. It's from Dark Moon Books, and it's called Exploring Dark Fiction No. 5. It's part of a series they've done. Exploring Dark Fiction No. 5, a primer to Han Song. So I guess I should really try and hurry and get my hands on that so I can read the story before attending the event. But in any case, that's a really cool chance to hear Han Song speak in an English language event, although I don't know, he does speak pretty good English, but some of it might be interpreted by the wonderful Guangzhou from Chinese to English. Not sure. I guess they'll find out on the day as well. But yeah, that's extremely exciting. That's all the TrChFic news. But before we charge right on, we actually have a quick ad break. Isn't that exciting? The ad break is just going to be me talking again, but we got a sponsor for the episode, so let's hear the ad. So exciting news, this episode has a sponsor. It's the Hong Kong-based publisher Blacksmith Books, and they're sponsoring us with their new title, Destination Peking, by friend of the pod and former show guest, Paul French. So if you know Paul French's wheelhouse, the content of the book will seem pretty on brand. It's about fascinating people, mostly Westerners who were living in and around Peking in the sort of late colonial first half of the 20th century. So think like jazz, dubious characters, risky business, all this very Paul Frenchian stuff, for lack of a better term. It's a gorgeous looking cover too, looks very China noir, like you'll know from when Paul was on my show, he's got some quite strong opinions about the design, Art Deco and other modernist aesthetics. So yeah, if you want a fresh dosage of Paul French's work on the history of China of this era, this looks like an absolutely fantastic one to pick up. I'll put a link to Blacksmith Books store where you can order the book in the show notes, but I guess it will be available through all your favorite bookshops, hopefully, and certainly Bezos Corp, Amazon should have this book too. But do right by the publisher, buy it from their site. That's the best thing to do. And once again, link will be in the show notes. So we're on the show with Ta-wei and Larissa Heinrich, the author and translator of The Membranes. So great to have you both on. How's it going and what have you both been up to? Let's start with Ta-wei.
Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be here, and everything is fine in Taipei, Taiwan. But I think that because of the pandemic, I still fear that I will be vulnerable to any disease. So I spend a lot of time being too panicking about my own health. So I do a lot of exercise, and I try to eat healthy and avoid any strong drink, any coffee. But I think that I will get myself insane very soon. I think that it's a kind of hypochondria right here.
No.
Is this a totally new thing since the pandemic? Have you never had these thoughts before?
I have had this tendency. Maybe some of you might find that some traces in the membranes as well.
Right.
The characters in the novel are too concerned with their health, and they are certainly too self-conscious. And I think that I share some characteristics with them.
Right. Okay. I see what you mean. And Ari, how's it going at your end?
Yeah, it's good. Thanks for asking. I guess Australia and Taiwan have in common that we've been able to move through this pandemic with relatively few cases for now. But the surreal quality of life and the changes in behaviors and everything is still here, still with us. And so yeah, I think I initially responded like Ta-wei did. I started jogging, and I hate running, hate jogging, hate it. I did it anyway because I couldn't do my usual yoga classes in groups and so forth. But then I injured a hamstring, and as a result, I've kind of haven't been exercising for a little while, and it's more frustrating. But yeah, other than that, I think everything's good. So my job at the ANU up in Canberra is a pretty new position for me, and so I'm still getting used to life there. It's a really beautiful city, and I hope that anyone listening feels free to come and visit sometime. They call it the bush capital because it's while it's a city, it's very small and manageable, and it's surrounded everywhere by mountains and hiking, and it's quite beautiful. So that's it. Just a kind of everyday life.
Nice. I've taken up running too, and it's I've kind of done it on and off, but this really was the time when running became a regular thing for me, and this is a huge victory for my dad, who is a really serious runner and wants me to basically just be a copy of him. And now he's finally starting to get his way. It only took about 27 years, but we got there. So I guess you've both told me a little bit about yourselves. Can you tell me and the listeners a bit more about yourselves and what it is you do? Again, Ta-wei, do you want to go first?
I was busy with creative writing, mostly fiction, science fiction, or quick science fiction in the 90s. And after that, I left Taiwan for the United States and got a PhD from UCLA. And after that, I came back to Taiwan to teach at a National Chengchi University in Taipei. Many friends have dissuaded me from teaching in college. They think that I should return to creative writing. So I think that Ari might be one of them, perhaps. So currently, I am associate professor of Chinese literature, but I might resume science fiction writing in any time soon. Thank you.
Right, cool. And Ari, what is it that you do with yourself day to day?
And I have to second that. Aside from everything else, I mean, Ta-wei is an incredible scholar, and he's known for his scholarship, but his writing is also just amazing. And so it must be hard to decide how to direct your energies. But it's his original mind. I feel like it would be a great service to continue to develop that science fiction writing. So for me, I maybe say that because, you know, I haven't tried to write that kind of fiction. It's not one of my areas of expertise, but I definitely am an avid consumer. So I consume a lot of that literature, both with my hat of Chinese literature scholar on, but also just for leisure. And so although my training and degree are in Chinese literature, in fact, the reality of my research over many years now has taken me in a lot of different directions. One of the main directions has been towards looking at biology and science and medicine and intersections between those things and art and literary culture, not just Chinese in the broader sense, but also from a lot of other contexts. And that's one area. And the other area has been an interest in queer studies of all different kinds, and also in translation. And for a number of years, all of these things ran in parallel, like three separate streams that rarely overlapped in any overt way. So working on translating Ta-wei's novel was a great opportunity to bring all of those things together in one place for the first time. And it was, kind of satisfying in a career way.
Yeah, it sounds like the only way they could have gotten a better translator for the book might have been if there was like a cyborg version of yourself, or someone who was also hugely into 90s cyberpunk. But yeah, that's gratuitous. So
it might be a cyborg.
Yeah, I didn't ask, did I?
I'm not 100% sure, you know. I don't know for sure.
Everybody is already one.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, of course. Silly of me not to realize that. So let's start talking about this book, The Membranes. I think before we talk about the actual story, it might be fun to talk about the setting. So before I ask you the sort of more intellectual question, I'll just frame. Here's a simpler one. What is the setting of The Membranes? What kind of a world are we in?
May I start with something personal? But okay. My partner and I have been together for a long time, and when I was trying to start writing a new science fiction story in the 90s, I was inspired by him in the 90s, and he was a graduate student focusing on the ozone, or the problem of the ozone. And he told me that very soon all of us will have to live under the sea, because the ozone is already seriously broken. What he told me was not anything too new to me, because many of us already knew about the threat, that the prospect that many of us will have to live under the sea. But the image really encouraged me to develop a story in which all of the human beings and many other lives have to stay away from the surface of the earth. So right. That's what. So that's basically the setting is from my partner's abundant expertise. He didn't continue it.
Right. Yeah, I remember one of the things that caught my eye the most about the book when I first heard news about it wasn't so much the very ahead of their time themes, but the fact that the gap between the original language publication and the translation was so big. So I thought, oh wow, is this a chance for me to jump back into the 90s when I was like less than 10 years old, and right away the references to the ozone layer, I was like, oh yeah, this is kind of nostalgic. But then I think quickly that was replaced by being struck by how futuristic the book was. But and the other thing I was on my mind as you were answering was a thing that feels weirdly the setting of people living in sort of closed off cities under the sea, and the sort of the real world of the surface of the earth being this danger zone. That sounds a little bit like the first lockdown here in the UK. We have to live in these little safe houses, little boxes that contain us. And then I was in the countryside at the time, but even going out the door, I felt like I was, in the danger zone, the contagion zone, no man's land. So I'm sure that wasn't really an intention when you're writing the book, but that it resonated with me in a very strange way, giving me memories of the first lockdown here in Scotland. Anyway, I'll stop rambling and I'll ask you the actual question about the setting I had lined up. It's probably, I think this is the spiciest question I had ready. So recently in discussions about, I think, sci-fi and also Chinese sci-fi, because that's something I'm quite interested in, I've seen people in their articles calling for sci-fi, or at least fiction, envisions futures which are just and progressive and inspiring rather than kind of dystopian and pessimistic. And
Yeah.
I have mixed feelings about that because I'd like the future to be better, but I much prefer reading sort of pessimistic fiction. And with the membranes, there's a lot of sort of, you could say, forward thinking or progressive or ahead of their time elements, but it's not such a for the future of the world in the story, it's not such a rosy picture. So do you think the membranes would make the people who are calling for sort of just progressive, inspiring sci-fi happy, or would you even want to try to make them happy?
Anyways, I think I am really impressed by your kindness, and you are a very idealistic, and maybe idealistic person. And in fact, I didn't. I seldom think about the question of future happiness, but I admit that I did try to imagine an alternative to the status quo in the 90s. And I think that maybe my revelation will make Ari smile. I think that there were at least two aspects of status quo I wanted to escape in the 90s. The one is obvious. In the 90s, I was looking for a more queer-friendly future. That's why I would try to imagine a very wild, queer, and non-normative fantasy in the membranes. And so we see that I wouldn't reveal too much, but anyway, the novel is very queer, and it's all about queer parenting, the parents, the children, and so on. And many of them are queer. And the second aspect is that in the 90s, I really wanted to escape Taipei for somewhere else, because Taipei at that time was very exciting, but also awful. I mean, Ari also visited and stayed in Taipei in the 90s, and he certainly remembers how disastrous the traffic in Taipei during that time. And we didn't have a subway, but the subway was not yet ready, and there was construction everywhere across the city of Taipei, and everybody was stuck in traffic in rain. And Taipei at that time was as messy as the city in the film Blade Runner. In Blade Runner, the city is always raining and very dark, and everybody is covered with certain slime in the film. And I think that so it's very close to what I felt in Taipei in the 90s. So I also wanted to escape Taipei. That's why the membranes virtually refers to Taipei or Taiwan very seldom. Virtually no. So because I try to find escape when I was writing the novel.
Right. I think escape is on a lot of people's minds today. So another good reason to kind of bring the book into English. Ari, did you want to add anything to what Ta-wei was saying there?
Yeah, I think it's a tough question that you ask, Angus, because on one hand, of course, I understand the appetite for something that is more optimistic. But personally, like you, my own consumption habits are more towards the dystopian, which feels more real, or whatever is written feels in the service of something genuine. And that genuineness may be a feeling or it may be a picture. But it often, if the idea of optimism suggests that you're imposing an ideal view on something that may not actually be true. So that always feels a little bit uncomfortable to me. I'd rather prefer the truth over the optimistic. In that sense, the novel is also, it's a novel about people. People are imperfect, and it gives you a window on certain types of interiority and relationships that I think we can identify with now. Like, for example, being alone with our computers all the time, or that sense of loneliness and being cut off from the world even while we're trying to reach out. That's sort of got an uncanny familiarity at this point in the pandemic. I think you can squeeze optimism out of that in terms of looking at something and knowing that you're not alone. Even 25 years ago in an imaginary figure, we've all had this type of experience. So, but I don't think that someone who's looking for kind of I would be surprised if someone looking for a specific understanding of a radical new positive future, I would be surprised if they're satisfied by this. But, I don't think that this book pretends to do that anyway.
Yeah, for sure. I think what Ta-wei said about having an alternative to the status quo, but not necessarily one which is perfect, that's sort of, if I was going to read some kind of optimistic vision of a better or possibly better world, or people having a shot at making a better world, that's something I would be pretty comfortable reading. The one author who I guess two authors who I can think of who've done that I've read are Ursula K. Le Guin. With like some of her stories are they seem like they're set in societies that she'd like to live in, but they're still societies with problems. And then the other one is my deceased countryman, Ian Banks, who's created a sort of a perfect society, but they still have outside problems to deal with, and they're still made up of people, and people tend to have problems. I don't really have any clever comment to make there, just agreeing with Ta-wei about alternatives that aren't necessarily perfect are a good sort of compromise. Because I think anyone who's writing something positive, really positive, has to come up against the problem of, a story needs some drama, needs some problems at some point. Otherwise, people will fall asleep or pay you no attention.
And with Banks too, Banks has a sense of humor, and so does Ta-wei. I'd say it's really important so that even when you're delivering that deadly punch, you're delivering it with a sense of humor that sort of suggests, hey, we can all laugh at this.
Right. That's very true. Yeah, humor and irony as well, I guess. So I think we need to talk a little bit about the story, just summarize it for the listeners. I will frame this one slightly. So the framing I was going to give was that there's all sorts of fascinating things about the story, and there's all sorts of difficult things about the story. And to be more specific, when I say things, I mean the contents of the story. There's some really interesting stuff, and there's some stuff which a lot of readers might find quite difficult or upsetting. And you can kind of see that if you look at, I was looking on the Goodreads reviews, and a lot of the reviewers were leaving quite long lists of content warnings about things that shocked them, but then would give the book like a 4 or 5 star review because they still liked it. So there's the contents, which are interesting but challenging or difficult, and the structure and the storytelling as well. Well, I won't try and describe it, but it left me trying to figure out, like, what kind of book am I reading here? So I don't know who I want to hand this to, but do we have an elevator pitch or a quick sort of summary for what the story is and who the characters are?
These days, I have talked to Ari that I realized that I have been preoccupied with the idea of parenting for a while, maybe for decades. So certainly the membranes is about many different topics, but for me is really about parenting or queer parenting. I say this not because I want to become a parent or I want to have a children. It's not. I don't think about it often, but I think that I am really concerned that how the parental figures are interacting with us, and how when we get older, how we become parental figures. I don't mean I don't mean to refer to my own parents, but I think that in many Chinese people are like me, and we are very preoccupied. Okay, you I think both of you know that in a society like Taiwan or in the Chinese societies in all over the world, many are so obsessed with topics about their own parents or about children, about families, especially nuclear families, and many talk about the possibility of escaping their original families, and many want to become better parents themselves. And I find that the book, so the membrane is basically about a queer parent and her queer child. Certainly, there is love between them, but they are also sometimes they are also abusive to each other. There is a lot of misunderstanding, and I think that these these facts are relevant to people in the 90s, but also relevant to people all of us now. I suddenly realized that I have been concerned with parenting also because that queer parenting or lesbian parenting becomes something very trendy in Taiwan now. And we know that gay marriage was legalized in Taiwan 2 years ago. And since then, before the legalization and after it, many queer people in Taiwan, especially lesbians, want to become parents. And I suddenly realized that actually many of my friends or colleagues are already queer parents or they are going to be parents. I often forget that actually I'm not too different from them. Although I'm not going to become a parent myself, but I have deal with topics about parenting in my science fiction. So I think that it's good to recall that what I have done in the membrane.
Thanks for that answer. I really appreciate the sincerity. And I can say, although obviously I'm not from any kind of a Chinese background, both sides of my family are pretty intense about family ties. That stuff's on my mind a lot too. So I really, yeah, I feel what you're saying totally about both being really, really invested in my parents, but also kind of occasionally imagining a world where I'm escaping, doing something else. That speaks to me. I wonder if we can sort of give any listeners who've not read the book or heard about it before a really sort of quick intro to the plot. So I'm just going to read the little blurb that's up on Goodreads, and I'll throw a quick question or something out. So here we go. It is the late 21st century, and Momo is the most celebrated dermal care technician in all of Tea City. Humanity has migrated to domes at the bottom of the sea to escape devastating climate change. The world is dominated by powerful media conglomerates and runs on exploited cyborg labor. Momo prefers to keep to herself, and anyway, she's too busy for other relationships. Her clients include some of the city's best-known media personalities. But after meeting her estranged mother, she begins to explore her true identity, a journey that leads to questioning the bounds of gender, memory, self, and reality. So the thing that strikes me on reading that blurb is some of the things we learn about Momo at the start are sort of like red herrings. It turns out they're not so important, and other things are really key to where the book's going. And like when I saw the title, The Membranes, I thought, right, are we going to be like going through the different layers of a person's identity and peeling away. But as I read the book, Ta-wei, the thing you did with sort of the style of the writing, switching from one style to another, and the structure, this very what's the word, unorthodox structure that you chose, it made me feel not so much peeling away as just totally unraveling or spiraling. I got really not lost, but I felt like I was going down a really steep slide. Like, oh my! And it maybe helps that it's quite a short book. So as I was reading, I was just rocketing towards the end, getting more and more confused, but more and more interested. So I wanted to ask you as well. Should we try and talk about the story or the structure, or would that be spoiling things for people who didn't read the book yet?
Okay. I think that it's
It's a difficult question.
We also know that many science fiction stories are like detective fiction stories in disguise. Both wrong. I mean, many of the science fiction stories also aim to discover the so-called facts behind the disguises, especially when many of us have been disillusioned into many false memories and false realities, virtual realities, and so on. I think that the detective, in fact, is a very I think that is a kind of simple, basic format of a detective fiction. But I think that maybe the writing style, the style of the language, the language, and so on, make the story looks kind of too excessive for readers.
Yeah, quite experimental.
I also know that some readers who have read the advanced copies show their concern with the surgeries in the novel, and I didn't. I didn't expect that the surgeries, in fact, the surgeries in the novel are not that graphic. But I'm surprised to find that some readers are unsettled by the surgeries in the novel, and I have to admit that I did mean to depict the surgeries, but in fact, in the 90s, the surgeries I tried to depict were not the surgeries on human bodies, but the surgeries on machines. As I said earlier, in the 90s, the traffic in Taipei was horrible, so many of us had to rely on motorcycles, and my partner and I had to rely on our motorcycles, our old and motorcycles in the rain. And we often had to bring all the motorcycles to the repair shops all over Taipei. So we often spend long hours in the repair shops waiting for the how to waiting for our the repairing process of our motorcycles, and it occurred to me that the images of the motorcycles taking apart look so similar to organisms, the organisms on operation tables, and I think that I got a lot of visual impact from my own motorcycle taking apart, and I wanted to capture the similarity of the machine and the human body I was imagining, but I didn't mean to portray the actual body myself. I think that Ari might know the human anatomy more than I do, because I read Ari's book, so I know that he might know the human body more sufficiently than I do. But I'm surprised that the readers will presume that I portray the surgeries on the human bodies too much.
Ari, do you want to take the baton there?
It's interesting. I think that in this work, as in many works of literature, there's an intimate relationship between the form and the content. And if you change one, the other one changes. So in this case, maybe it's that people are more accustomed to seeing this type of structure in a film rather than in a book, for example,
Right.
Where you might be disoriented temporarily by one scene, but you know that soon enough you'll cut to another scene and get more information, and that there might be a twist somewhere along the line. And so I think in that sense, the structure makes sense given how the plot unfolds without giving too much away. And that I think, talking about Blade Runner and so forth, I just assumed, I think, when I began translating that Ta-wei was an avid movie watcher, that you would watch a lot of movies and that this kind of cinematic structure might be in your mind.
Oh,
and indeed, I secretly wish that this book could be made into a movie of some kind, but well, it's true though. So I think there's something in that, so that the structure is going into it. It does seem like a narrative of a certain familiar form, but you'll be surprised because you wind up in a rabbit hole going somewhere you didn't expect to go. And that some readers are going to like that, and other ones are going to be a little bit uncomfortable with that. And that's good. That means it's a good book. If a book makes everybody happy, there's probably something wrong with it, I think.
Sure. Yeah. So I didn't really have any questions about translation or the craft of translation here, but I think here on my piece of paper, but I think this is a good chance to throw one at you, Ari. So one of the unconventional things the book does, if I'm remembering correctly, because it's a while since I read it, is we start with quite a lot of exposition, quite straightforward, sort of just exposition about the main character Momo's life. So Ari, did you have to make any decisions as a translator about how to render anything like that, or was it fairly straightforward?
That's a good question. I mean, the part of it for me was trying to understand who is this person as a character, because once I get a sense of who she is, that will tell me what kind of language, which vocabularies I want to draw on. And, as we all know, it's not one-to-one with Chinese and English. You have a million choices that could go in so many different directions. And then part of it is this long process of negotiating what that final meaning may be. So early on in a translation, I feel like I have no clairvoyance. I don't know, I can't predict what the final product will look like. I've read it in Chinese and I know what the feeling is for me. And I might interview people who've read it in Chinese and ask what they took away. But yeah, it's very open-ended, the first draft. So I don't know if, I know every translator has a different method. For me, I do many, many drafts, starting with one that's super, super rough just to make sure I understand what's going on, and then narrowing down, picking different paths. And it was like that with this one. And I guess I'm really lucky that Ta-wei is here and was so generous and willing to chat about the specifics. So it's a really different matter to working with a text by an author who is no longer with us. And the responsibility shifts. So yeah, that was really helpful to be able to ask questions and then to understand this person. And then I think, in the end, I'm just like some random academic nerd. I may not have the best social skills. There are all kinds of things that the characters I'm translating may be better at than I am, or who may be worse at. So sometimes in the end, I'll also consult native English speakers who don't know Chinese at all and say, when you see this, what do you see about this person? What comes across? Does this seem consistent with her character? And things like that. So those decisions that you mentioned, Angus, were really hard to make at the very beginning. And I just make them very broadly at first, knowing that I'm going to come back and refine it later on. Like the very first draft looks very ugly, very ugly.
Right. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I've got one more question before we go on to the next section. And this has jumped into my mind as soon as Ta-wei started talking about the bodies being like motorcycles or vice versa. It's about influences on the book from sci-fi, because we talked about Blade Runner a bit. That right away, bodies and vehicles. I haven't read this book, but one of my favorite sci-fi writers is J.G. Ballard, and one of his more infamous books is Crash. So sort of like, I guess there's, when it comes to human bodies and machines, there's, I guess, sort of there's stuff from, I don't know what you'd call this, like everything before cyberpunk, before the 80s, all this sort of post-war or even pre-war sci-fi that deals with machines and bodies and stuff. And then thinking of cyberpunk, or at least the things which you could call cyberpunk, which I've consumed is fairly limited, but one of the only animes for grown-ups I've ever watched is Ghost in the Shell, which I guess was having its moment in the 90s. So I don't know if these things are things that you're into, Ta-wei, but were there any influences from sci-fi that you can cite apart from Blade Runner that helped inspire the memories?
Yeah, I have two points to make. The first that is that many people of my generation in the 90s, we were hugely influenced by Hollywood productions. So we know, like Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator series. Okay, I often tell my students today in Taiwan to watch Terminators, but they always ignore my request because they think that the Terminator series are too old-fashioned. They are not cool at all. So they wouldn't watch them. But they were very inspiring to me when I was working on the Membrane. Oh, okay. The Arnold's science fiction movies are not queer at all. But I think that the way how memories and human bodies are reconstructed, how they are distracted, were very enlightening to me at that time. And in fact, I could, in the 90s, I can get some inspiration about queer lives from certain artists and philosophers, and get skills of science fiction from others. And I think that I learned some skills from Hollywood productions at that time. And the second point I want to make is that actually in the 90s, some local commentators in Taiwan already mentioned that the Membrane reminded them of Ghost in the Machine. Ghost in the Machine sorry, is that Ghost in the Machine?
Ghost in the Shell?
Sorry, Ghost in the Shell in the 90s, because Ghost in the Shell in the 90s was already, okay, there are several versions, and it was already very, some earlier versions were already available and popular in Taiwan. But I have to say that, in fact, I was not that familiar with Ghost in the Shell, and I was not really a fan, so I didn't think that I was very strongly influenced by it, and there is something essential. Ghost in the Shell capitalize on the female body a lot,
right.
And that animation is so obsessed with the female nude, but but the Membrane is not, and I was not interested in the female nude in the 90s. So the body I was conceptualizing in the 90s was totally abstract. I was the novel and I were not interested in the fetishization of the female body at all. So I think that the Membrane might make some readers think about Ghost in the Shell, but I think that is more about coincidence rather than any actual influence. And in fact, I have to say that during that time, many writers and or fans of science fiction were also influenced by many other cultural products from Japan, like Akira.
Right.
The animation was, I think that was even more influential than, it was more obviously influential than Ghost in the Shell in the 90s to many writers of my generation. Readers might agree that the Membrane is filled with despair, with many different things like parenting, maybe a despair about parenthood and so on. But there is also some mysterious enthusiasm in it, and I would like to admit that the Membrane was also inspired by the gender theory and the queer theory I was reading in the 90s. And during that time, students and some young artists of my generation were so excited with the new gender theory, feminism, and the LGBT theory from the West, especially the United States in the 90s. And we were so, maybe we didn't understand those theories sufficiently, but they enable us to imagine certain narratives. And so I think that the membrane is also a narrative trying to digest the American series at that time. And maybe this is also why some readers find that the membrane feels so weird because the membrane contains certain inspiration, maybe not imaginable to not includes certain inspiration whose origin might be just too kind of obscure to the readers today.
Sure. This actually, I remembered what I wanted to say, and what you just said, I can actually connect the two things. So what I was going to say was about when you said maybe it's a coincidence that the membranes and Ghost in the Shell have so many similarities. But there's a word from biology, at least a term I learned in high school in biology class that it's one of my favorite phrases. Convergent evolutions. So it's the idea, like if you think of the, I'm trying to think of an example, like the echidna in Australia and then the hedgehog in the rest of the world, two almost identical animals which have no connection, or basically no connection on the big family tree of all the species in the world, and yet they've somehow converged into something similar. And I kind of wonder if in the 90s across the world, maybe more so in developed countries and maybe even more so in some of the megacities in East Asia, there was some relevance that cyberpunk sort of network related stories had. I think another thing Ghost in the Shell and the Membranes did for me was what you were describing about feeling sort of weird, in that there was writers like yourself in the 90s and maybe the 80s as well, trying to imagine what the future might look like. And maybe some of the predictions have no bearing on our reality today, but other things are just strangely relevant. Like Ari used the word uncanny earlier. And I can think of stuff that, like, I think I mentioned this on a bonus episode I did. There were like obsessions with things like cyberspace in the 90s. I remember cyberspace being this cool word when I was a kid. But then I grew up as a teenager and even like early 20-something thinking, cyberspace? This has no relevance to my life. But now, here in lockdown, I think I live in cyberspace. It feels so relevant. And there are aspects of the membranes that speak to that, having a virtual existence. And like in Ghost in the Shell, like it's the version of that I like the most is the TV show. And there's stuff in season 1 and season 2 of Ghost in the Shell that seem to have predicted our reality, like a network of strange alt-right terrorists who have like weird nationalist but also completely discordant ideas. That's season 2 of Ghost in the Shell, but that could be describing America in 2016 to 2020. It's really uncanny. So yeah, I don't have a question for you there. I just was itching to say that. So I think we should keep going. We've been going for approaching an hour now. So the next set of questions I've got, it's about the contexts, both of the original publication of the book and this English translation. So I think it's a gap of something like 15 years, I think. I should have the numbers in front of me. But so like the mid 90s, was it 1995 was the original publication?
In 96.
96, okay. It was only one off. That's good. And then we've got the new, the English translation today in 2021. And I didn't check. Is this the very first translation of the book? It doesn't exist in other languages? Oh, whoops. Which other languages?
the Japanese translation was available 10 years ago.
Oh, right.
And the French translation was available 5 years ago.
Oh, gosh. Well,
Yeah.
pardon me.
The Japanese and the French translators had their own different motivations from the Anglophone one. I think that the Japanese publishers have been interested in literature in Taiwan, so they are often more they are if they want, they are often quick to translate Taiwanese literature. And the French people simply enjoy science fiction. And I have to admit that I was so shocked when I visited France for to promote my French translation, and I found that the French readers simply they will buy any science fiction available, even without knowing what the book is about. So it's a very shocking. I went to a science fiction festival in France, and I find that many French readers bought my book and the French translation and asked me to sign for them. And naturally, I asked them why they would be interested in my book, and they admitted the reason was that they knew nothing. They couldn't expect anything, so they bought it. It's quite the reasoning was certainly moving, but also stunning to me.
Awesome. Yeah, I remember a long time ago now, I attended a genre fiction symposium at the Leeds Center for New Chinese Writing, and one of the guests was French. I think it's Brigitte Duzan, I think. I probably mangled that pronunciation of her name, but she talked a little bit about the French book market and how books in French bookshops are organized. And it sounded completely different from anything I've seen in an English language, or I think even any of the Chinese bookshops I visited when I lived in China. Speaking of uncanny, like a country that's not so far away from where I'm sitting right now, but where the attitude to reading is really quite different, like you're describing. It's interesting, but I want to keep the conversation moving here. So the first question I've got is about the original context of the Chinese edition. So you've talked a little bit about what Taiwan was like in the 90s Taiwan and Taipei you were living in. You mentioned the traffic a lot, which I didn't see coming. I guess Ari and Ta-wei, you were both there in the 90s. What can you say anything else about what it was like and what the significance of the membranes was in that context? Ari, do you want to go first? You've not spoken for a while.
Sure. For context, I mean, it's so different. I'm not from Taiwan, and so my experience being there was, entirely my own. And I loved it. I loved the chaos, what I interpreted as chaos and availability of the city, like so easy to travel through. And the punk scene was so alive, and there were aspects of it that I found so much more accessible than I did in various cities in the U.S. at the time. So because that was the age I was at, it was just very thrilling. And so in a way, I kind of feel wedded to that period. So much was going on. Like I think of it almost like, and Ta-wei can correct me here, but from the outside looking in, it seemed like there was a flourishing going on, like Paris in the 20s. There was something going on in the air at that time, very lively, maybe post-martial law. And that really was just fascinating. So that's why I keep returning to that period to look at what was going on there.
Ta-wei, is he right, or is Ari imagining?
Yeah. I would say that actually, I think that the 90s often, people often say that the 1990s is a golden period for queer fiction, queer literature in Taiwan. But not only that, I think that Taiwanese society was especially exciting in the 90s. And I think that maybe even more exciting than Hong Kong or China at the same time. China in the 90s was not that, for many reasons, was not that exciting and kind of quiet. But the Taiwanese cultural things in the 90s were was certainly flourishing uh, and kind of I think that people at that time were willing to do a lot of experiments. I think one reason is very decisive. Economy in Taiwan in the 90s was especially good. I remember during that time, young people in Taiwan had could afford more time and more expenses on cultural events and cultural production, cultural consumptions, and so on. And in some sense, young people in Taiwan in the 90s were a bit luckier than those in Hong Kong, China, Korea, and so on. So that's why many would have nostalgia for the 90s in Taiwan. But while there were a lot of opportunities in the 90s, many would also want to, many would be so greedy that they would reach out further. I mean, like me, I saw that I didn't get enough cultural nutrition in Taiwan, so I would want to leave Taiwan for the United States in the 90s. It was also because that I was Chinese people in the 90s were kind of optimistic. So I would want something more. That's why I would leave Taiwan for the States in 99. One important and useful reference for all of us is qíng, and of course, both of you have read qíng and very familiar with qíng. And qíng is a legendary writer, and her books became very representative of the 90s. And from Jing's books, we can see that the young people of her generation, which is also of my generation, were not so worried about financial prospect, were not so worried about employment, but they were willing to do a lot of experiments about their lives, and they will want to embark upon creative writing or other arts. The 90s was kind of a romantic for many.
That actually you've given me some memories of quite far back in this podcast when I had Brian Holton, the Chinese to English and also Chinese to Scots translator, and he was saying some really similar things about, I guess, a time when he was younger in 1970s Britain and Scotland, where I guess maybe the economy wasn't booming, but it was people my age or even younger than me, like maybe 20s to 30s, had an easier ride. It was easier to get a house, you could delay climbing up the career ladder, or even if you didn't want to climb up the career ladder, there was unemployment benefits and art grants and so on. So that was maybe the time that was the time in the UK when punk, you could be a punk. There were lots of punks, because I guess similar to Taiwan, there's a little bit of a buffer or a cushion or something where you can go out and produce culture, have ideas and so on. And now it's not like people have stopped doing that, but times have changed. Things are a bit more austere. So Next question. This is about the current context that this English translation is coming out. What does it mean to have the membranes in English in 2021? Does reading the book feel really different if we revisit it now? I don't know who wants to take this one first. Maybe Ari, do you want to go first?
Sure. I just think it's critical in so many ways. Some of them are just accidental or coincidental, and some less so. So, for example, in English, as you know, translations of Chinese language science fiction have been having a kind of renaissance for 6-7 years now, winning awards and doing really well in English language markets, which for any translator is always a bit of a surprise. Like you kind of never expect, a translated work to compete with something written in English originally, and yet it's happening. And there's some fascination with Chinese visions of the future, and something I could say more about would be aspects of Orientalism that shape that interest in Anglophone readers for some readers. But so there's this wave of interest, and yet it does tend to overrepresent mainland China. So in a purely in a truth-telling mode, I would say it's important to make sure that readers understand that there are many other really good works of literature out there that predate some of these ones even, and function perhaps in more sophisticated ways even sometimes, that come from different parts of Sinophone world. So in that sense, I feel like it's really important to have the book as a counterbalance, but to describe it only as a counterbalance doesn't do it justice. I mean, the book stands alone in its own right. It's very strong work. And I've often said that, of course it has a science fiction component that appeals to science fiction readers like myself. But it also is a kind of psychological portrait. It's also a work of literature where the science fiction is almost not quite incidental, but it's the context, it's the backdrop against which this kind of meditation on parental relationships unfolds, against which it unfolds. So I think that's really important too, because it's just like any other good work of literature, you hope in translating it that English language readers can get a sense of something they can relate to, something that they can identify with in some common experience. And in this case, there's a lot to relate to. And the book offers things, I think, to people who are interested in science fiction, but also to a lot of other people as well. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but it's sort of a roundabout.
I think it does, yeah. There's one other aspect I want to ask both you guys about. It's the thing I keep bringing up and shoehorning into the conversation, cyberpunk. So a lot of us have been living in online bubbles due to lockdown. I don't know how much of this is just me and my own interests, but I see more references and discussion of like the relevance of either contemporary or like 80s, 90s cyberpunk to things still going, either things which have continued to go on in the world or things which are resurgent in the world or new developments in the world. I can only really think of one example of like a new resurgence of the 90s sci-fi in pop culture, and that's the Matrix 4. God knows why, but there's a Matrix 4. Keanu Reeves presents the Matrix 4, or something is supposed to be coming, and we could probably quite easily think of some parallels between the Matrix and the Membranes, probably quite a lot actually if we were really trying. So do either of you guys think the sort of cyberpunk tropes and mode are worth kind of resurrecting or continuing to evolve in this coming decade, or is that sort of misguided nostalgia? Should we not bother with that? Anyone want to go first?
Okay. Yes. Cyberpunk has been certainly very important. The relation of the membrane to the genre cyberpunk is not that substantial, and it's interesting that in fact in Taiwan many readers and writers are already familiar with the term cyberpunk, but somehow I find that we have been busy with variations of a cyberpunk. That's why I would earlier before our interview, I was thinking if the membrane would be categorized as bio punk instead of a cyberpunk. I say this because recently I talked to some younger writers in the States, and I asked them what the science fiction they read. And they tell me that they are reading biopunk, and the cyberpunk is something kind of too old-fashioned for them. And I'm puzzled, and I'm surprised. And then, I see, so maybe, is the membrane that close to the category of cyberpunk in which in the Taiwanese context is often comparable to film noir or film noir in film, because in cyberpunk and the film noir, we know that both of them feature very depressed single man in black and in search of femme fatale. That's what cyberpunk means in the Taiwanese context. But
Right.
perhaps the newer term biopunk will be closer to the membrane. And I also find that there are also readers who comment that the membrane is about climate change. And so there is another term similar, like a something. Sorry, it's a neurological.
Wi-Fi.
So I think that certainly the rubric cyberpunk remains very important, but many readers and I might find that the variation of cyberpunk more relevant. So like biopunk or other terms.
I have a very strange personal anecdote, which at first is going to make no sense. And then by the time I finish, you guys will see where I'm going. It's maybe got something a little bit in common with the membranes. So recently I learned that in chickens, there exists DNA code for teeth, the kind of teeth that I guess dinosaurs would have had. And if you were to edit the genetic code of a chicken, it really wouldn't be so hard to help those genes express themselves and have chickens with teeth. And I was talking about this with a listener of the show, and the thought that popped into my head was, sounds kind of like a hybrid of like a, speaking of mainland Chinese sci-fi, a Chen Qiufan story, who is sort of like Mr. Modern Update of cyberpunk in so many ways, the new William Gibson, people have called him, and then Liu Cixin, who has a little bit of a strange obsession with dinosaurs, or at least he's written a lot of sort of dinosaur sci-fi stories. And then that made me think in my brain, what will happen in Google Images if I search for dinosaur cyberpunk? And the answer is there's loads of cool fan art of like cyber dinosaurs. It sounds so stupid, but it's amazing art. And to make this relevant to what you were saying about biopunk, it seems to me like, although yeah, like the sort of like Blade Runner noir, often quite orientalist picture of cyberpunk, that is pretty dated. Like it's like when they made the sequel to Blade Runner, it's a good thing it was so different. It was colorful and stuff, so different from the original. But the point I want to make is cyberpunk seems to be a genre, appropriately enough, that hybridizes and evolves and does different things quite effectively. You can, like with biopunk, you can take it a lot of places, both in practice, doing interesting things with it, but also just it helps that you can stick any word before punk, and you've got something interesting: biopunk, solar punk, this and that punk. But so to turn this into a question, what is biopunk? What do you mean by that, Ta-wei? Because I'm just kind of guessing what you mean.
I am not so good at the definition, but I would think that by biopunk, of course, I'm thinking about like bio art that Ari is very familiar with. Bio art and biopunk are very concerned with the manipulations of organisms, including human bodies. Because of my long time interest in gender theory, queer theory, and the disability studies, certainly I am very interested in the bodies and the transformations of bodies, and that's why I would think that biopunk might be closer to my own preoccupation. Maybe I don't know it is so. Maybe I don't really capture its definition very precisely, but I imagine that in the future, if I write anything new, any new science fiction, I will still try to develop like new devices about human biology. And I have to say that for instance, for the time being, I have been very interested in the our everyday wearing devices, which monitor our human bodies, our heart rates, and so on. And I think the wearing devices are, of course, very relevant to the genre of biopunk instead of cyberpunk.
Ari, can I pass the baton to you? Do you have anything to say on this area?
Not much to add. I really support that, though. I think biopunk is an excellent category, a way of framing the book. And all along I've been thinking, Angus, you already brought it up a little bit, but it's always interesting to me how something like Blade Runner, which has had such an outsized impact as a cultural object, how things like that actually also originate in a kind of techno-orientalism. So they kind of have been built on these stereotypes of the rainy, crazy Asian city with its no ethical, control over technological development, into that fantasy that then goes full circle or is translated back again and goes off into all these different directions. So in that sense, cyberpunk has also had that legacy in the past in English languages. So it's interesting to see it kind of removed from techno-orientalist contexts and thinking about something that is very self-consciously using these different mediums, these different languages together. I don't know if that's making any sense. But...
No, it makes a lot of sense. That's made me realize a question I forgot to write down in my list for you guys about the sort of cultural or not cultural setting of the book. So the surface of the earth has been scorched. There's not really much to orientalize there. There's not much left. And then under the sea, I think if I remember correctly, there is some mention of like the territories humans have built their domes in. There's some remaining semblance of like nations or continents or something, but it's pretty clear that one's nationality doesn't necessarily have to dictate where you, or one's nationality or ethnicity doesn't dictate necessarily where you live. So to bring up mainland Chinese sci-fi again, a thing I find kind of disappointing in sci-fi from mainland China, which I generally think is amazing and I'm really interested in, but I feel like there's a little bit of a failure of imagination in some of it. So like in Liu Cixin stories, we're often looking at a world where humanity has to let me be more specific. In the Three Body Problem and in Wandering Earth, both of them, humanity has to come together, and they do come together, but nations and strict boundaries between nations and nationalities still exist. In like Three Body, it is a nice breath of fresh air where like the Westerners aren't saving the world, but most characters are sort of a stock stand-in based on their nationality. So all the Westerners are assholes or extremely often preachy assholes, which is, it's not completely untrue. And then like in Wandering Earth and Three Body, there's a treacherous Japanese woman in Three Body. There's technically two, I suppose. So like there's a failure of imagination there's a success in imagination to go beyond so many limitations. Amazing forward thinking, but when it comes to like nations and things like that, nothing. We're frozen in like 1999 or something. And in younger mainland Chinese sci-fi authors whose short stories I've read, the rigidity isn't there, but there's not really such a, I'm trying to think, like there was one story I read where we're in a city, presumably it's China, most people are Chinese, there's one or two characters who seem to be foreigners, but it's not clear if they're like citizens, if citizenship is possible, or if they're expats or something. It still feels a little bit like we've not, I don't know, that the sort of the status quo is still there in some form, or it's not being interrogated. But in the Membranes, we've got quite an international cast who all interact quite freely. You don't really feel a sort of, passport ID card wall between the characters. And there's a lot of references to things from other cultures, be it like Japanese culture, Western culture. It felt like I was reading a piece of literature that exists, in the world, not in one country. Maybe that's just me carrying in my own biases with me.
No. I think that you capture. Am I interrupting? but
No, go for it. I was running out of things to say, so you saved me.
Because I appreciate that you noticed something very important, and I would say that it didn't occur to me, but since you say it, I agree that I find that the science fiction in Taiwan and the science fiction in China are very different in regarding the obsession with the national boundary or nationhood. Usually, the science fiction in Taiwan is tends to be international and is not so concerned. It's not so obsessed with the national boundary or territory. And I will also add contextualize the membrane by saying that in the 90s, because in the 90s, the Taiwanese younger people, artists, writers had more time and more capital to devote themselves to creative writing, and then many would be willing to learn a lot from other countries, and that's why I think that's why the membrane was very membrane alluded to a lot of international cultural legacies, and we also see the same tendency in Qiu Miaojing's novels. So so basically, Chinese fiction in the 90s was not really motivated by nationalism. The science fiction in China today, I agree that there are many wonderful works, but meanwhile, I also find that it's clear that some of them are so popular because they align with nationalism, which is not necessarily bad, but we see that it's certainly a major motivation. That's why we can see that so many readers are why they are so passionate about science fiction in China. The passion itself is interesting.
As a person in living in, well, as a Scottish person living in Scotland, what you're saying about nationalism not always being a completely evil force, of course I agree with you, but I think, and I don't know if yourself as a Taiwanese person feel this too, but growing up and living in a country which is also by some definitions not a country has taught me how sort of illusory and how illusory the whole idea is. So yeah, clinging too hard to it can be a bit silly. And so like in, not to keep making fun of poor Liu Cixin, because this one is not his fault, but in like the movie adaptation of The Wandering Earth, where all of humanity is living in dorms, which have like their own national flag, and everyone's still living in little it's just like, it makes me shake my head that we'd still be producing, or the human race would still be producing stuff like that in the 21st century, which leads to one question I'd like to ask, which we didn't ask yet, which is a question for both of you. Are we living in the future that you guys were expecting in the 90s, given that this book is kind of a portal back into that time? What do you guys think of the future we live in today? Just because you've not spoken for a while, I'll give this one to Ari first.
That's such a deep question, and it's a hard one. While you've been talking, of course, my mind has been wandering to other speculative fictions and thinking, oh well, after all the effort of world building, only to reproduce the problems of the world you're leaving behind. It is disappointing when science fiction does that. I read. I think a lot of us love Octavia Butler because she doesn't do that. She's willing to say, okay, here are the problems of society, and when I'm reinventing the world, I'm not going to reproduce those problems knowingly. And Ursula Le Guin and others. And Membranes also does that. It doesn't assume that things have to end the way they began. So that's kind of an interesting question. And so as for where we are now and how that relates to the past, God, I don't even know. I mean, no, I think because in spite of whatever troubles I had when I was younger, I think I was fundamentally an optimist, and I wouldn't have anticipated that we really would succumb to climate change in the way that it has been happening. And yet, so it's a bit scary and disappointing. And I still have some optimism though. And I still also try to remember that nothing is ever what it seems like. That reality is a very complicated question. So I don't. I just try to keep an open mind and see what this moment holds. But in a more direct answer to your question, I'd say no. It really doesn't. I never expected that the things I was reading as fiction would in fact become documentary. Essentially, like that's how it feels. Like something like The Membranes and other works that were meant to be abstractions, threats. This is going to happen if you don't act, and then it happened. So they're not fiction anymore. And that's weird.
Totally, yeah. And I was somewhat idealistic as up to like, I don't know. I really don't know how I would categorize my past self, but my present self is pretty pessimistic. So I think a lot of the dystopian stuff we've been producing could come in really handy as a reference point in the decades to come, which is going to be the life we're all living.
That's a good point, because we can actually use this material that people have dedicated their lives to creating ideas about how we can cope with it. So it's not like we come in and, with no weapons or no preparation.
Yeah, like I remember back in like 2011, 14, my university lecturers were saying, "Isn't it funny that Hollywood's only producing dystopian visions of the future?" But it's like there is a good reason for that. Climate change, and it resonates with like people myself who, as a kid, grew up and from like not day one in school, but our teachers were pretty clear, like, we're heading nowhere good here, guys. It's real. And then when the movies kind of emphasize it's real, I don't see the need to get too upset about that. But anyway, I'll try and stop just vomiting up my own opinions. Ta-wei, what do you think about the future we're living in? How does it match up with what you were expecting? And this could be in terms of both society and also just technology. Has technology disappointed you or surprised you?
Okay, in the 90s, when I was writing The Membrane, the internet was already available in Taiwan, and it was not extremely not yet very extremely popular, but I remember I was one of the earlier writers who chose to write on a computer instead of on paper. That was kind of new in the 90s. And I recall my email addresses in Taiwan at that time, and my email address at UCLA might be worth mentioning. For instance, my email address at UCLA is android@ucla.edu. And my email address in Taiwan in the 90s is also similar, android at something. So I certainly, like many of my friends, I was sensing that the internet would become big, but I didn't expect that the social media would be so overwhelming, so decisive in the 21st century. On the one hand, I'm so excited with this because it fits my social media, fits my personality very well, because I'm a person who prefer to be left alone without any living person around. I will be very happy to spend time along with my dogs. But very soon, I also find that certainly the social media is certainly also very harmful. I'm not really talking about the famous documentary Social Dilemma, showing how social media is detrimental to all of us. I only need to mention one thing. Social media is exhausting. It's very maybe is harmful to the mental health, but obvious is, but I only want to mention that indicate that it's very harmful to the physical health, harmful to my eyes, and it makes I become more obviously worn out every day because of social media. So I think that I think because the infinity of social media actually exposes how limited my own physical life is. So that becomes a nightmare because of the infinity of social media. I find that my lifespan is so short, and I really shouldn't spend the time as I used to. So that's the future, the future I'm experiencing, and I'm still ambivalent about it.
Yeah, so the fear of missing out on things, FOMO, the way that has sort of, what's the word? The way that's manifested for me is I think it's sort of is linked to social media. Like upon leaving China, a place that was maybe a little bit like what 90s Taipei was for you guys, really a fun place where I was able to come out my shell a bit. Upon leaving, I thought, right, I'll just clone myself and I'll leave my clone to keep living this life here, and I'll go back to my home country and live the serious life. And I think, as strange as this sounds, part of that fantasy involves the copy of myself who's still enjoying himself in Shanghai having an Instagram account that I could check, which is completely insane when you think about it. But yeah, like so much of those happy memories are linked up with a little shared virtual album of photos I made on Instagram, all these little square photos put through filters. Yeah, the way this stuff messes with our heads in ways that we probably can't even, that won't even be obvious to us unless we reflect a bit or unless someone points them out is pretty scary. And the other grumble I have, speaking of like disappointing futures, is the idea that a website as rubbish as Facebook would be sort of the front page for the internet, given everything we know the internet can do, is I find that really disappointing, and I hope something better replaces it. But again, I'm going to stop just ranting and ask, was there another question I had? No, what I'm going to do now is I need the bathroom quite badly.
Any Chinese characters? Did you ask us to nominate any Chinese character to you?
Oh
yeah, 你先去洗个手 go to the bathroom if you
yeah, you guys have your deliberation. I'll be back in a few minutes. Thanks, guys.
And I have to tell you that I cannot consider any Apple Watch for the time being.
Oh,
because I find that I'm so obsessed with wearing devices. I for instance, I have the ring, and I check my score all the time. I check how it evaluates me all the time. And more comments that I'm already obviously paranoid. Yeah, it's very controlling. It's a control freak.
Yeah, it's very. Where did you find it?
Actually,
did you find it like in the bottom of a lake?
No. Actually, it's recommended.
Oh well, it's hard. It's an addictive thing. I'm similar. I think I would do the same. But the watch, stay away. It'll also listen to you. You won't have any privacy.
And I feel guilty whenever I lay down the ring. I feel guilty.
Interesting.
Okay, I'm back.
What happens if you let somebody else wear it for a while?
Oh, of course that would be cheating. I think that I feel bad naturally. We were talking about the wearing devices, like the Apple Watch. Yeah.
Did either of you guys ever see a thing in I don't know if you guys do use WeChat, but there was a thing in WeChat called WeWalk. At least that was the English version. Did you guys ever see that?
No.
It was the thing that used the footstep tracker on your phone. It's like a little optional feature of WeChat, Weixin. And it made a league table of like you and all your friends that had WeWalk, and you could see how many steps everyone had taken. And it was, for people who don't like to lose, it was a really strong motivator to like get out of your flat and march around the city, find excuses to go places just so you could be the winner. And it was relentless because it reset every single day. It wasn't and it actually did work on me. I was making myself walk around more just so I could win this imaginary number that was being generated by, my phone tracking my own footsteps.
Is WeWalk safe?
Yeah, it was just literally a little function of WeChat, the mainland Chinese app, and it would just show you a league table of your number of footsteps. It didn't track like where you, well, it probably did track where you went, and it sent the information to Tencent or the Chinese government, but your friends would only see the numbers. But no, I did have the running app Strava on my phone recently, which tracked. Yeah, I could publicly share where I went for runs, and I wanted to see. I was in the countryside in Fife, a pretty rural part of Scotland, so I was really curious to see where else are people running, given that there's not very many roads here. And I found right away I could like learn the running routines of people in the town nearby. You could see their names. You could break it down into men and women, and it's like, what the hell? That is dangerous. So I deleted the app. It was also, creating like, it was making the guy who didn't like to lose in me want to run more and more and further, which is, good motivation, but probably bad for the mental health. Okay, I think I remembered the question I wanted to ask. So I had a whole series of comparison questions. One was about Notes of a Crocodile and Tiong Miaojin, but I think we hit on that already. Another was mainland Chinese sci-fi. We hit on that already. Another was cyberpunk. I think we bashed that one into the ground already. I did want to ask both of you, I know, Ta-wei, you have an answer here. Have you read much mainland Chinese sci-fi? And do you have any thoughts on it that you haven't shared already?
I find that certainly I need to read the recent science fiction from China, and I also teach my students in Taipei to read them, and some students and I happen to enjoy Hao Jingfang more. I think maybe because Hao Jingfang is a female writer and who is especially known for Beijing folding Beijing 折叠.
Beijing Jidya, folding Beijing.
Folding Beijing, yeah. I think that the reason is that I think that some other science fiction writers smell so strongly of men, so strongly of masculinity, and and then I feel that it's maybe I am too sensitive to that. Their works are also interesting. For instance, Liu Cixin's novellas are also enjoyable to me. Like I remember there, for instance, the one is called to rescue the ancestors, and the other is called to rescue the offspring. May I Google it?
Go for it. I can think of one which is a short story that exists in English translation, where all these like old people who are kind of like gods come to Earth and they become members of people's families. That sounds possibly like the ancestors one, but I'm not sure. I don't know the Chinese name.
Okay. I think that the two novellas I'm referring to are his 赡养上帝 means to feed the god. Because of to feed the gods, because in the story the gods they need to be fed by humans to survive. And in in the same year, also 2005, there is another story by Liu Cixin called 赡养人类, means to feed the humans. In the story, it is the humans in general who are impoverished. And I think that the novellas, actually, they are more manageable for me to teach in the classroom, because it's certainly is too ambitious to assign the students to read the three body problems. And I find that and I also, and I can imagine, in fact, I can imagine why Liu Cixin stands out among the science fiction writers in today's China. I think that he shows some, maybe some, sorry for the word choice, humanitarianism from the Cultural Revolution trauma. I think that so I find that there is more relatable compassion and sympathy in his science fiction, and I think that will be more relevant to the readers in Taiwan today. And and the younger writers, the younger science fiction writers in China are brilliant, but I find that they don't excite that. Okay, they don't stimulate Chinese readers that readily. But Hao Jingfang might be not. I think Hao Jingfang is well received in Taiwan, but perhaps her attention to the her style is not that masculine, and so it's more acceptable to the Taiwanese taste.
Yeah, I can see what you mean about the Liu Cixin and having a sort of humanitarian concern, because when I think of his stories, I kind of think about the really bleak pessimism and sometimes the sort of anti-human angle, like we are such a small speck in the universe. But at the same time, you're totally right. Like there is a real compassion for sort of like the fate of humanity there as well. And one of the things I like about the stuff by him I've read is that both those two things are sitting there and they sort of are either clashing against each other or they're feeding into each other. And thinking of Folding Beijing by Hao Jingfang, I can see a similar thing. Like it's kind of a very impersonal story about a city and a system, but there's also sort of very zoomed in pictures of the lives people are living and the struggles they're facing, whether it's the people at the bottom layer who are struggling to get enough food to eat and pay their rent, or the people in the middle world who are struggling with sort of the career ladder and all those expectations. Yeah, and like the other, I've read her novel that's available in translation, covered it on the show actually, Vagabonds, or was it one Liulang Ma'ers, I think is the Chinese name. And it struck me the same way. There's like a real concern for people's emotions and feelings, but at the same time, it had a sort of very cerebral, intellectual, not so human side to it as well. So yeah, I can see a similar thing in both those authors that could appeal to people. I think that was all my comparison questions. I think I'm ready to move on to the silly stuff now. First silly question, and I know you guys deliberated on this a bit. Can you either individually or collectively suggest a Chinese word of the day to represent the membranes?
Ari, may you?
I was just thinking, good old 赞, like 赞美的赞. Just because it's so, it's a word that now everybody understands in a certain way that before Facebook wouldn't have had any, the meaning has transformed so dramatically so that, it's entirely because of internet and expression of approval or, but it doesn't really, it's not really a specific, it's not really specific to this book.
Yeah, it's the one, I associate that one in my mind with the little animated WeChat stickers of a guy doing a million thumbs up. Zan, 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 zan. Is that the one? Yeah. Ta-wei, do you have one, or are we going to stick with Zan?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I nominated qíng as in 亲人 in 父亲母亲. And again, because I want to emphasize the motive of parenting, and in addition, qíng also refers to intimacy and affinity, and certainly these are very sensitive issues in the membrane as well. And so far, I think that I'm still trying to dealing with the challenges about intimacy and distance with distance from fellow human beings. That's why earlier I said that I am so worn out, but also fascinated with social media, because social media is also about the qíng, affinity, intimacy, or
So
distance.
That sounds more convincing. Let's go with qíng.
we can do two, but yeah, qíng and tan, that's great. I guess I want to ask you one more question about social media, Ta-wei. Do you think it can go somewhere good? Do you have hope about the direction social media is going, or do you hope we can escape from it?
Hope. I think that so in fact I admit that it's already very toxic, and it might be even more so in the future. And I as a teacher in college, of course, I often envy how useful and energetic my students are. But meanwhile, I'm also very I'm also complacent and relieved that I don't need to grow up in um, in a culture where social media evaluates everything about me or about my peers.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need to compete with my peers on social media, because many of my peers or colleagues are not active on social media at all. But my students are so concerned. They really calculate how many likes they get every day, and do they get more likes than their peers, and do they need to go to the gym in order to get more likes on Instagram? And I can sense their suffering, and I know that in the I can it's easy for all of us to foresee that the kids in the future, young people in the future, will suffer more from social media, because everybody wants. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I have a little sister who's 14, and I try to worry sometimes about like what she's going through dealing with social media, but it defeats my imagination. I can't get my head around what that must be like, because I had, I guess, an experience with some of the very first waves of it. Like, I think the thing that drove me crazy at that age was MSN Messenger, being able to stay at home and talk with people who I would never talk with at school virtually, and then meet them in school and have nothing to say. And like in hindsight, that was pretty weird and not necessarily healthy. And I just sort of wonder, but I don't think it had a very strong impact on who I am today. So I never know even how much I should be worrying and how much I should just trust kids like my little sister and kids her age to be able, growing up in that environment, to know what they're doing, or possibly have no idea what they're doing. It just totally defeats my ability to make predictions.
But I have some students tell me that they enjoy my Instagram, and I'm surprised why the reason their reason is is amusing and surprising to me, because they find that on Instagram I often recommend books or recommend events like talks. So the students feel that they don't feel competition from my Instagram account. They only find that teachers advice, and they feel it's very calming and very warm to them.
It's really nice.
In fact, I don't. I think that is also. In fact, they could have interpreted my intention to be patronizing, but they didn't think that way. But anyway, so my Instagram messages are less harmful than their peers.
Yeah, that's an app that I hear a lot of people saying is an awful place for in terms of like mental health or just the way it distorts reality. And I found that in my own experience, and maybe this is because of how I use the app and who I am, I found it to be quite an upbeat, positive place in many ways. But maybe that's because the things about it that might drive me crazy don't affect me so much. Whereas like Twitter is the one that I look at that and I get a headache, and I don't see much generosity there. Whereas like, I don't know if that's similar to your experience, but like it seems easier on there to have a little bit of a sincere engagement without having to worry about someone finding something to attack you for. I don't know. But the fact that you're able to be there as a teacher and, be appreciated by your students, that's really nice. That's social media being good, I guess.
Well, I don't have anything much to add either. So
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's just march on then. Next question, an even sillier one. If the membranes was a drink, what would it be?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think you have an answer ready, right?
In fact, the question to the question, I want to nominate kombucha. And kombucha is something, in fact, relatively new to me because when I see the jar, I think that, I used to think that it was only a kind of ordinary drink, something to any other juice. But once I realized that actually it was developed in jars, and the jars look like the eggs in the famous science fiction film Aliens, because the jars look like in the jars I see the jellyfish like stuff, and in fact at first I couldn't associate what I saw in the jars with kombucha I normally understood. So I think that the kombucha is quite but I know that I hear that it's healthy, so maybe it will be good, relevant and good to all of us.
You've made me realize maybe the Ridley Scott film I kept talking about shouldn't have been Blade Runner. Maybe it should have been Alien, because I think it's especially in some of the later Alien films, motherhood, daughterhood, or weird alternate ways to be born or to create life or to manipulate, transform, modify life. That's a parallel with the membranes, although obviously in the membranes that's a happier story, and in Alien it's a horror story. But is there anything deeper we could say about that connection?
It's interesting that you brought it up. But it occurs to me that nowadays friends of my generation and I often tease each other by alluding to the film series Aliens, and how the very the queer parenting in the Aliens series. But my friends and I seldom talk about Blade Runners. I think that so in fact the aliens, the allusions to aliens are already in our everyday life. We refer to the characters very casually without thinking much. But the Blade Runner is in fact kind of distant to my everyday life. So I agree that the okay, and in addition, and the pandemic, the COVID-19 makes us pay more attention to the facial mask, the surge, the mask, and the mask really resemble the organisms in Alien. But the pandemic reminds us of the Alien movies, but not of Blade Runner. So Aliens certainly closer to us.
Interesting. I've just remembered something I meant to bring up when you mentioned Terminator and the fact that those are Arnold Schwarzenegger movies. I think I'm just speaking very generally here. It's amazing the jumping off the how far we can get if we use some of these sci-fi films as a intellectual jumping off point, because it might be out of like Blade Runner, Alien, and Terminator, probably the easiest one for your average person to just dismiss and try to ignore would probably be Terminator, because it's like Arnold Schwarzenegger, action movie, robots. That's three reasons someone might have to think this is like a movie for meatheads. There's nothing deep here. There's nothing weird here. But actually, like Terminator, it has all the cyborg stuff, and then the stuff with time, the future coming back to try and construct the past. That's a really weird idea the more you think about it. And then in the Alien films, people might instinctually write those off for so many reasons. We had those terrible Alien Predator crossover movies, and in these last two films, Prometheus and especially Alien Covenant, Ridley Scott. I mean, I love Prometheus actually, but Alien Covenant made me want to bash my head against a wall. It was so disappointing. But we have to, like, it's very fruitful if we either get back to what made these films so captivating in the first place, or this is kind of what I like to do. If you're trying to use it as an intellectual exercise, forget the fact some of it is silly, some of the films were bad. There's still lots of interesting ideas. Like Alien Covenant has some really interesting stuff going on with the two cyborgs. These things are extremely fruitful, and for me anyway, I find them more fruitful than conventional like art films or literary films. I really think in some of sci-fi and fantasy, especially sci-fi, we could do a 10-hour podcast easily, because this stuff is so interesting and cuts into what it means to be modern humans, like so much. Anyway, I keep doing this. I keep going on and on about other films and books, never mind the membranes. So last question in this section for both of you guys. It's a self-promo slot. If listeners want to see more things you've done, or buy some things by you, or find you online, where would you send them? Ari, do you want to go first, since you've not spoken in a while?
Sure. I don't have a website yet, maybe someday, but I do try to put as much free stuff as I can on academia.edu. So that site, although it has its problems, at least it's easy. So a lot of essays that I've written, anything that isn't subject to serious copyright infringement issues, I just put it all there. So if anyone wants to, other than that, if anyone's ever interested in something that I've written and they can't find it, just email me and I'll send you a copy. The other thing is that my last book, Chinese Surplus, is now available open access. So it's also very easy to download for free as a PDF. So that I don't think people should have to pay for difficult scholarly theory works instead. So it's, but there's still parts of it which involve, futurisms and bodies in strange formations and things. So if anyone's interested, they can find that.
Can I bug you? What is the elevator pitch for Chinese Surplus? What's it about?
Well, Chinese Surplus is an academic book. So one of its main target audiences is other academics. However, it has aspects which might be of interest to broader population as well. And it's basically a study of how the human body becomes a tradable commodity in contemporary life, and how those commodities all have different values, and some bodies are worth more than others. And in that book, I'm looking at Chinese bodies in particular, and how they get evaluated as meaningful in the world, as valuable in certain biomedical or artistic contexts. So the argument is one that you could apply in other areas as well, like African studies or African American studies or elsewhere. But in that case, in that book, I'm just looking at cases of Chinese bodies that have been sold or where a price tag has been attached in different contexts in the world, and trying to get underneath what produced that disparity of value of the human body.
Great. I guess since that's open access, I'll when I'm putting the show notes together, I'll just pop a link for that one up for anyone who's sold on that elevator pitch. It's right there. The magic of open access. Awesome. Ta-wei, what about yourself?
Yeah, I am very vain, so I have my own website, which is taweichi.com, TAWEICHI.com, and I just throw everything there. My the links to my Instagram, my Twitter, and so on. So although I'm critical of social media, I'm still subscribing to it.
Fantastic. I mean, this is somewhat caused by the Great Firewall, but it's not so often that I'm covering an author on the show whose Twitter I can promote, or sometimes they have one, but they don't use it. So yeah, it's cool that we've got someone that listeners could quite easily follow. And even, I don't know, if a listener had a question for you, would you welcome it via social media?
Oh yeah. Cool, in fact, so far this year, because thanks to Ari's translation, some readers of the review copies already gave me very wonderful recommendations of arts or books they are working on, or they enjoy, and I learn a lot from them. Yeah, so
awesome.
I learn a lot from. So it's in fact I'm happy to interact with them.
Fantastic. And that actually connects nicely with the next question, recommendations. If our listeners want more like The Membranes, other stuff they could read, where would you point them? As Ta-wei, do you want to go first?
Okay, I will point out the two directions which my okay, and they are very different, but they are also books maybe you all might have known already. The first is as I mentioned many times, Qiu Miaojing's books. Qiu Miaojing is one of the best known, internationally known writers from Taiwan, and her two books. She's lesbian, and her two books are already available in English translation. One is translated. One of them is translated by Heinrich. The last word from Montmartre, and many know that the Ocean Vuong's book novel On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous, but it's worth noting that the Ocean Vuong's book starts with a quotation from Qiu Miaojing, and that quotation is from Heinrich's translation, and it would be great for readers to see the connections among Asian, queer Asian and the queer Asian American writers. So I would recommend it. We will recommend Qiu Miaojing books in translation. The other is by saying that I might congratulate myself, but I really need to say that Ishiguro's new book, Clara and the Sun, is a best-selling science fiction now. It's a new book, but I'm surprised to find that it's kind of reminds me of The Membrane as well. But I don't imagine Ishiguro is influenced by The Membrane. In Clara and the Sun, the novel also focuses on a very strange relationship between a mother and a daughter. So in some sense, it's kind of similar to The Membrane. And I'm surprised with the similarities. I think that the Ishiguro's new novel is certainly similar to his earlier ones, like The Remains of the Day. So it's also perhaps some readers will find that these comparisons interesting.
Cool. Thanks for that. Ari, do you have any pointers for listeners who want more of similar works?
I would just second that. I hope someone writes a review at some point and brings together Ishiguro and Ta-wei's books because there is some really rich conversation to be had between the two. I didn't have a specific set of books to read that are like Membranes, but I have had a pile of books on my own reading list. The problem for me is I always am doing academic reading first, and so every time I want to read something, I put it in a pile, and the pile's gotten very big, and I don't know when I'll get to read it. But here's one called Dear Cyborgs by Eugene Lim, which is like queer and weird and sci-fi. Here's a really great one. I have read part of this one. It's called Connor and Seal by Ji Liang Ko, and it's actually a poem about gay men lovers in the future. So it's weird science fiction future gay men lovers, but in poetry form. It's amazing. And then there's this one by Severance by Ling Ma. I haven't gotten to it yet, but of course I know what the plots are. But then there's finally Leave the World Behind by Ruman Alam. Then there's one last one that I'll recommend, and that is this one's called, it's weird, it's called Apsara Engine, and the author is Ishak Sam, and it's actually a graphic novel format, and it involves all kinds of weirdness like time travel and conversation and love affairs, and it's so cool how this author makes those things work together. Like a lot of the illustrations you'll see are just people having conversations. It's like the hardest thing to illustrate, I think. Because that's all it is, at one panel after another, someone talking to someone else, and yet it's so rich in like making the time go by. So that's some examples of books that may or may not be in the same spirit, like queer sci-fi, some vague connection to diasporic Asian identity.
Right. I've got two that have sprung to mind during this call that I'll drop for the listeners as well. One of them is going to make me, for anyone who's listening to the show for a long time, they might be suspicious about me being not really much of a reader, because this is recycling a past recommendation. Okay. On the episode I did with Ken Leo, actually, on that Hao Jingfang book, Vagabonds, I recommended Sophie's World by Justine Garder, because Vagabonds was directly trying to deal with like philosophy, to some extent anyway. It was trying to be quite directly, not quite just fiction. And Sophie's World is sort of an intro to philosophy for younger people. It's about this girl who meets a rather strange teacher who sort of chapter by chapter just introduces her to like an idea, connects it to I think it's always a Western philosopher, and then you get some sort of weird fantastical goings on which keep you interested. But it's not the philosophy that I think makes that book similar to The Membranes. It's two things. It's that it has a bit of a turning point where things get very strange and the reality that we've taken as a granted sort of unravels. I can't actually remember exactly what that moment is, because I read that book when I was quite a lot younger. But there's one of my favorite moments in The Membranes. We go into sort of an infinite loop, or a moment when the story, it's almost like someone hit a pause button on the story, or like if it was a film, I would imagine the image glitching, and then reality is just upended, and then is progressively sort of unraveled, and we get closer to what the real reality at the core or beneath the surface or something is. And Sophie's World isn't really remembered for this, but from what I remember, in its final act, things get very strange, and we end up with a reality that's very far removed of what we started with. And there is a bit of a doubling going on. I remember that there's some sort of other Sophie that the real Sophie is trying to reach. And we didn't talk about this much in our conversation, but in The Membranes, there's Momo and there's a somewhat mysterious character called Andy. And they are some kind of a strange dark mirror image, or I don't know what the right term is, but there's some kind of mirroring or doubling going on there. And the other book that sprung to my mind when Harry, you showed us the strange poetry book. There's a very weird book which I read. I didn't even necessarily enjoy it. It's by Mark Z. Danielewski, the guy who did the House of Leaves. His next book was this bizarre book called Only Revolutions, about a young guy and a young girl who are they're on like a road trip or something, and it's one of these ones you can read it backwards and forwards. One page is the boy, the guy's narration, and the other half is the girl's narration. I was completely disorientated the whole way through reading it. Unlike the Membranes, I didn't really feel like I understood what was going on at the end. The Membranes has that advantage over it. But again, they're supposed to sort of serve as literally a mirroring, because the book, you can flip it upside down and read the other character's story. So how connected that is, I don't know. But there's a similar sort of character dynamic, or a somewhat similar character dynamic. And I think there's the same sort of experimental spirit. I'm not sure if you were trying to write something really experimental, Ta-wei, but I kind of felt that a little bit of an avant-garde, or trying to really get out there, do something really unique. But yeah, so my very last question now for you both. What are you both reading just now? I think, Ari, you might have kind of already answered that. But
well, I have one last book to add to that, but just separately.
Sure.
I've been reading Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future. It's a big book, and so it's not one to eat in one meal, but it's very interesting. And actually, it comes back to earlier in our conversation, we were talking about optimism versus pessimism, and I would say that the book is actually, it falls on the optimistic side, because it imagines, what if everyone did cooperate? What could we actually accomplish? And in typical Kim Stanley Robinson way, it's incredibly detailed, sometimes more detailed than you can really absorb, but really going into the nuts and bolts of, okay, let's imagine, if we're going to build a world that survives, what will that look like? So it actually is a bit encouraging. So I recommend it for that reason.
So long as it's a good read too, it's perfect. Ta-wei, what are you reading just now?
In that I also got the Ministries of Future, Ari just mentioned, but of course it's also on my pile. And I just finished reading the science fiction novel by Ian McEwan, Machines Like Me. And it's a novel about cyborgs, and I'm kind of shocked by it. I find that the book is shocking and admirable. And it explores some dimensions of cyborgs that I haven't thought about clearly. So I find that I learn a lot from the book, and I find that it shows me that there's still a lot of room to explore whenever we imagine the characters of cyborgs.
Fantastic. Some great recommendations there. I think that is all the questions I had. So is there anything we've missed you guys would really like to say before we wrap it up completely?
I can't think of anything.
In fact, I may add something, but it's quite irrelevant. But may I say that my partner is a translator of transporting into Chinese in Taiwan.
Oh wow!
Yeah. So he and I also have feel some affinity with Scotland, and we would love to visit Scotland when everything is clear very soon.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you there's both good and bad news. Daily life in Scotland is usually not like an Irving Welsh novel, but it also can be sometimes.
Everybody
have you?
Over.
Yeah, there is sobriety and drunkenness, but not just drunkenness. This is again not really relevant. Have either of you read his book, The Acid House, or have you heard of that? It's a short story.
Yeah. But it's published. In fact, in Taiwan, long time ago. I should check it out. Yeah, it's available there for a while.
It's quite an old book. That was one, I guess it's probably from a similar time as The Membranes. And similarly, parts of it are like, oh yeah, this is the 90s. This is a different time. And other parts, it's like, whoa, this is more advanced than anything I've seen. So I have parallel I never would have seen coming. The Membranes and Irvin Welsh. On that note, though, I guess I'll just say thank you both for coming on the show.
Thank you.
It was
Thank you.
an awesome chat. Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
And I hope this book gets all the coverage it deserves, because it's a really interesting book.
Thanks. And thanks for your work. I know it's a lot of work to do these interviews and transcribe and stuff. And I think your website is awesome. It's like such a resource. Such a great resource.
Cheers. It's been good to make the connections, and I'm glad the website has got useful stuff on
it's
it.
fantastic.
Yeah,
I'm going to use it in teaching, like students will be really glad to know about it.
Cool. Have you found the map on it?
No.
I made a little custom Google map where I plot, where I can, I plot like where the author is from and the setting. And that, I mean, it does have a pretty strong bias towards Jiangnan, so like Shanghai, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Beijing, and also sort of like the Guangdong, Hong Kong sort of area. But it's getting more interesting now because we're starting to do the sort of the wider Sinophone world and also stuff in or around the borders of mainland China. So it's probably for a teaching perspective, it's probably got two uses: zoomed out, seeing the bigger picture, and then for like urban literature, zooming in on where everything is in Shanghai. And
I'll have to take advantage of that function. So far,
it's really cool.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to hit stop.
Okay, that is the end of the episode. So now we're just going to do the old plugs. I'm going to do something a bit different, not completely different to be honest, but I thought I would just tell you guys a wee bit about what's up for grabs, so to speak, on the TrChFic Patreon, all the bonus episodes I've been making. So I'll just go through the most recent 5 that have been posted, and then the next 5 that are scheduled. I'll summarize them all really quickly. So on March 11th, I did a preliminary thoughts on this very book, The Membranes, where I kind of gave my thoughts upon reading, upon just having finished the book, how I was feeling, what I was thinking. I did touch on some things that I did not touch on in the interview, so quite literally, there is bonus content there for you. Then after that, we have the cover analysis of Monkey King Journey to the West. So another book that has already been covered on a published episode on the show, but this was a breakdown of the cover itself on all the paratextual elements like the quotes, the blurbs. So I was using my sort of publishing expertise, trying to look at it at a more technical level and seeing what I could say and extrapolate. Then there's 2 more preliminary thoughts episodes upon getting about halfway through or just upon having finished a book. One was Zero and Other Fictions by Huang Fan. That is a book I'm aiming to cover on this Taiwan season, so if you'd like to steal a march on me, so to speak, then that is up on the Patreon. And then I have a preliminary thoughts and a post-read thoughts on Playing for Thrills by Wang Shuo. So if you listen to those 2 back to back, you can see what I thought of the book halfway through, and then what I thought about it upon finishing. These episodes are all roughly about half an hour. Some of them extend a bit further than half an hour. There are some Patreon episodes further back that are briefer, but I would say these days on average, they average about half an hour. So they're a bit shorter than episodes on the main show. Now there are absolute donkeys. There's a lot of episodes scheduled for release that will be coming out over the next few months. I'll go through the next 5 quickly. So I have a preliminary thoughts on Notes of a Crocodile. And then a post-read thoughts, actually. So the same thing. You can see where I was at halfway through that book, which is Queer Lit from Taiwan. We'll be covering on this Taiwan season. And then you can see how I felt once it was finished. Then we have another preliminary thoughts episode on The Man with the Compound Eyes. That's some Taiwanese climate fiction, cli-fi, climate science fiction, that, again, I'm going to be covering on the show. And then if you skip 2 episodes past that, on May 25th, there will be a post-read thoughts. You get how I felt upon finishing the book, my reflections upon it. Between those 2 episodes, there's thoughts on a sort of China related but not Chinese fiction book, Miracles of Life by J.G. Ballard, which is a memoir of his life, funnily enough, an autobiography, which opens with his life, his childhood in Shanghai, which makes for a really interesting comparison with the depiction of it in Empire of the Sun. And Shanghai is pretty close to my heart, so there are some thoughts there. And then, screw it, I'll just tell you the other 2 that are queued up. One is another post-read thoughts. It's on Taipei people. So, as you might guess, that's another book I'll be covering in this Taiwan season. It's kind of sort of more literary fiction. So that's a book
that had some really crystalline, powerful moments, and I try to get some of those feelings across in this Patreon episode, and hopefully I'll get them across in the main feed too. And then last of all, yet more friggin' Chinese sci-fi, because I can't stay away from it. Post-read thoughts upon finishing a new Liu Cixin translation book of Ants and Dinosaurs, another Clash of Civilizations story. Don't know when I'll ever cover that on the main feed, but there'll be a bonus episode on that one up on June the 9th. So just $1 per month gets you access to the Patreon. There's more shows on there now than there are on the main feed, so it'll keep you occupied for a very long time. Unless, I mean, even if you do power through it minute by minute, there's hours and hours and hours and hours of content there for you now. Quite proud of it, and every bonus episode has a thumbnail that I'm mostly proud of them. There's a few shitty ones. The Playing for Thrills ones weren't as cool as I thought they were when I was making them, but there are some really nice ones too, like the Zero Huang Fan one I think is a nice little piece of Photoshop art. But anyway, what can you do to help the show apart from signing up to the Patreon? Well, there are other ways to support the show too. You can find a support link on the main website, which is TrChFic.podbean.com. All sorts of goodies are up there on the main website, actually, like the TrChFic map that I mentioned to my unsuspecting guests at the end of the interview. Now, of course, though, the best thing you can do for the pod is nothing to do with money, really. It's just by spreading the word. So if you know anyone, friend, family, teacher, colleague, whatever, who might be interested in the show, tell them. Tell your cyborg twin. Tell your queer parent. Tell your super straight parent, if you have one. Tell, who else could you tell? Tell the little man that lives inside your computer who might be more real than you are. I don't know what that means either. Anyway, 再见.